My name is Ruth, and I'm 53 years old. My husband James and I have been happily married for 25 years, raising our 8-year-old daughter, Grace. After 5 years of estrangement from his family, we accepted an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner at his parents' home. The atmosphere was tense with unresolved issues from the past. I noticed James growing increasingly anxious as we arrived. Suddenly, without explanation, he shoved Grace and me into the pantry. If you're watching this, please let me know where you're from. In the comments, hit that like button and subscribe to hear what happened next in this terrifying moment. The tension between James and his family had been brewing for years. His parents, Harold and Margaret, were incredibly wealthy, but equally demanding. Harold built a successful investment firm from the ground up, creating a financial empire that he expected James to eventually take over. The problem was that James had other dreams. He wanted to pursue photography, a passion his father dismissed as a worthless hobby. Growing up in that massive house with its manicured lawns and cold marble floors, James always felt like an outsider in his own family. Things came to a breaking point 5 years ago. James had reluctantly joined the family business after college, trying to please his father. He worked diligently alongside his older brother Thomas, who had always been the perfect son in Harold's eyes. Thomas embraced the corporate world, married the right woman from the right family, and had the perfect set of twins who were being groomed for future success. For 3 years, James tried to fit into the mold his father had created, but his heart wasn't in it. When he finally gathered the courage to tell his parents he was leaving the company to pursue photography, it ignited the worst fight of his life. Harold called him ungrateful, weak, and a disappointment. Margaret stood silently by, not defending her son, but not joining in the attack either. That silence hurt James more than his father's words. "You walk out that door, don't bother coming back," Harold had shouted as James packed his belongings. And James hadn't. For 5 years, he built a new life with me and our daughter. We weren't wealthy like his family, but we were happy. James established a modest but growing photography business, and I worked as an elementary school teacher. We had Grace through adoption 2 years after the estrangement, and James's parents had never even met their granddaughter. The call from Margaret came out of the blue one evening in early November. James stared at the phone in disbelief when he saw his mother's name on the caller ID. I watched his face transition from shock to wariness to a complex blend of hope and fear as he answered. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. I could only hear James's side, but I saw tears in his eyes several times. Margaret wanted reconciliation. She missed her son. Harold was getting older and had been in poor health. Wouldn't it be nice for Grace to know her grandparents? They were hosting Thanksgiving as always, and they wanted us there. "Are you sure about this?" I asked James after he hung up. "It's been 5 years with no contact." "Mom sounded different," he said quietly. "Softer somehow. She said Dad regrets what happened." I supported James's decision to accept the invitation, though I had my reservations. Harold didn't strike me as the type of man who easily admitted mistakes, but James needed closure one way or another, and Grace deserved to know her family if possible. James had one condition for accepting the invitation: no discussion of the past conflict during the visit. This was to be a fresh start. According to James, Margaret readily agreed. As Thanksgiving approached, Grace bubbled with excitement about meeting her grandparents. We showed her photos and she practiced saying, "Grandma Margaret" and "Grandpa Harold." James tried to match her enthusiasm, but I could see the strain behind his smile. Late at night, I'd find him staring out the window or looking at old family photos he'd kept hidden away. The morning of Thanksgiving, I spent extra time selecting my outfit. I wanted to make a good impression, but not appear as though I was trying too hard. I settled on a burgundy dress that was elegant without being ostentatious. James dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, looking handsome but tense. Grace wore a new blue dress with a matching headband, practically bouncing with anticipation. The drive took 3 hours, taking us from our modest suburban neighborhood to the affluent area where James had grown up. As we got closer, James began pointing out landmarks from his childhood: the ice cream shop where he'd spent summers, the park where he'd learned to ride a bike, the creek where he'd catch frogs with Thomas before they grew apart. "Your daddy caught frogs?" Grace asked from the back seat, giggling at the thought. "The biggest ones you've ever seen," James replied, momentarily lightening up. "Once I put one in your Aunt Stephanie's purse before she started dating your Uncle Thomas. She screamed so loud they probably heard it in the next county." As we turned onto the long tree-lined road leading to his parents' estate, James fell silent again. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel. I placed my hand over his, and he gave me a grateful glance. "It's going to be okay," I assured him, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. "I hope so," he replied, his voice barely audible. "For all our sakes." Harold and Margaret lived in an exclusive neighborhood where the houses were separated by acres of perfectly landscaped grounds. Their home was a sprawling colonial-style mansion with white columns and dark shutters, imposing in its grandeur. A fountain bubbled in the center of the circular driveway, and a Range Rover and Mercedes were parked near the front steps. I noticed a security guard discreetly positioned at the entrance to the property, which seemed excessive even for such a wealthy area. James hesitated before ringing the doorbell, taking several deep breaths. Grace held my hand tightly, suddenly shy now that we had arrived. When the door opened, Margaret stood there, elegant in a designer dress, her silver hair perfectly styled. For a moment, no one moved. Then Margaret stepped forward and embraced James, tears spilling down her cheeks. "My boy," she whispered. "My boy has come home." James stiffly returned the hug, his body language betraying his discomfort. When they separated, Margaret turned her attention to Grace kneeling down despite her expensive outfit. "You must be Grace. I've waited so long to meet you." Grace, usually outgoing, hid partially behind me, but offered a small wave. Harold appeared behind his wife, tall and commanding, despite the slight stoop of age. His handshake with James was formal, lacking the emotion of Margaret's greeting. When he turned to me, his eyes assessed me quickly, and I felt immediately judged and found wanting. "Ruth," he said, nodding curtly, "welcome to our home." The foyer was a study in opulence, with a crystal chandelier hanging from a high ceiling and a sweeping staircase leading to the second floor. Family portraits lined the walls, and I noticed that most featured Thomas and his family. James appeared in the older photos but was conspicuously absent from anything recent. We were led into a large living room where the rest of the family waited. Thomas rose to greet us, looking like an older, more polished version of James. His wife, Stephanie, was slim and blonde, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Their 12-year-old twins, William and Victoria, were dressed like miniature adults and regarded Grace with cool curiosity. Several other relatives were present: Harold's sister Evelyn, with her husband George, Margaret's cousin Patricia, and a few others whose names blurred together. Each greeted us with varying degrees of warmth, their eyes lingering on James with undisguised interest. We were clearly the main attraction of this gathering. "Let me show you around," Margaret offered, taking my arm. "James knows the house, of course, but it's changed some since he was last here." As James engaged in stilted conversation with Thomas, Margaret led Grace and me on a tour. The house was even larger than it appeared from outside, with formal and informal living spaces, a home theater, an indoor pool, and numerous bedrooms. When we passed one closed door, Margaret paused. "That's James's room," she said softly. "We've kept it just as it was." She opened the door to reveal a time capsule, a teenager's room preserved perfectly for 15 years. Trophies lined the shelves, and photography books were stacked on the desk. A camera, an older model, but expensive in its day, sat on the nightstand. "We never changed anything," Margaret said, a note of something like defiance in her voice, "no matter what Harold said." As we continued the tour, Margaret asked polite questions about our life. Where did Grace go to school? How was my teaching position? Was our house comfortable? Each question carried an undertone that suggested our life must be lacking, compared to what James could have had. When we passed a wall of family photographs, I noticed something disturbing. There were recent photos of Thomas, Stephanie, and the twins. There were even new photos of Harold and Margaret. But the only pictures of James were from before our marriage. It was as if they'd frozen him in time, refusing to acknowledge his life beyond their influence. I noticed you don't have any photos of our wedding, or of Grace as a baby, I commented. Margaret's expression tightened momentarily. James didn't send us any. The unspoken truth hung between us. He hadn't sent them because they hadn't been speaking. As we rejoined the others, I noticed several things that set my nerves on edge. Harold took a phone call in the hallway, speaking in hushed but angry tones. James, watching from across the room, tensed visibly. Later, passing a window, I saw Thomas engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with someone in the garden, gesturing emphatically before noticing me and abruptly ending the conversation. Most concerning was the security presence. Beyond the guard at the entrance, I spotted two others patrolling the perimeter of the property. When I mentioned this to James, he frowned. Dad always had security, but never this much for a family gathering. He murmured, his eyes scanning the grounds outside. Something's not right. Before I could press him further, Margaret announced it was time to move to the dining room for dinner. As we followed the group, James gripped my hand tightly, his palm damp with sweat. Whatever happens, he whispered, stay close to me. The dining room was a showcase of old money elegance, with a gleaming mahogany table that could comfortably seat 20. Crystal glasses caught the light from another elaborate chandelier, and the china was edged in gold. A traditional Thanksgiving spread covered the table, a massive turkey cranberry sauce, various vegetable dishes, stuffing, and several pies waiting on the sideboard. The meal probably cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. Grace was seated between James and me, with Margaret on my other side. Harold took his position at the head of the table with Thomas at the opposite end. The arrangement felt strategic somehow, as if Harold wanted to keep James within his line of sight. After a perfunctory grace, Harold began carving the turkey while a staff member poured wine into the adults' glasses. I noticed James barely touched his remaining alert and watchful. So James, Harold said, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, Ruth tells us you're a photographer now. Making a living at it, are you? There was a clear note of skepticism in his tone, and I saw James's jaw tighten. Yes, Dad. I have a studio downtown and a growing client list, mostly corporate portraits and events, but I've had some gallery showings for my personal work. Harold made a non-committal sound and turned to Thomas. Tell James about the Anderson merger. That's the kind of work you could have been part of, son. Thomas looked uncomfortable, but obliged, launching into a description of a recent business deal worth millions. As he spoke, Stephanie interjected with perfectly timed supportive comments, like an actress who had rehearsed her lines. The firm's on track for its best year ever, Thomas concluded, not quite meeting James's eyes. That's wonderful, James replied neutrally. Congratulations. Margaret turned to Grace, who was pushing food around her plate nervously. Grace, do you do any activities at school? William plays lacrosse, and Victoria is quite the pianist. Before Grace could answer, William piped up. I'm captain of the team and I'm only 12. Coach says I could go to college on a scholarship. Victoria nodded primly. I practice 2 hours every day. Grandmother says discipline is the key to success. Grace shrank in her seat. I like art class, she said softly, and I'm learning to ride a bike. There was an awkward pause, and I felt a surge of protectiveness. Grace is also reading 2 grade levels above her age, I added, and she just won a science fair at school. Margaret nodded with polite interest, but I could tell Grace's achievements paled in comparison to the twins in her eyes. As the meal progressed, I noticed an undercurrent of tension that went beyond family awkwardness. Stephanie made several references to a big development coming for the family business. Harold kept checking his watch. Thomas and his father exchanged meaningful glances when they thought no one was looking. Everything needs to be finalized by the end of the weekend, Stephanie said at one point, her voice carrying a hint of excitement. Harold shot her a warning look, and she immediately changed the subject. James was growing increasingly agitated beside me. He kept glancing at his phone under the table and startled when a car door slammed outside. Once, when the doorbell rang, he nearly knocked over his water glass. The staff member who had been serving dinner went to answer it, and James and Thomas both watched the doorway intently until the server returned alone. "Just a delivery," the server announced, and I saw both brothers relax marginally. I tried to keep the conversation flowing, talking about my experiences as a teacher and complimenting Margaret on the meal and home. Grace gradually became more comfortable chatting with her cousins about school and movies they enjoyed. On the surface, we might have appeared like any family gathering, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. During dessert, Harold brought the conversation back to James's decision to leave the family business. "You know, some people make mistakes when they're young. There's always a way back if you're willing to admit you were wrong." James set down his fork. "I wasn't wrong, Dad. I made the right choice for me. My only regret is how it affected our relationship." Harold's expression hardened. "Some decisions have consequences that can't be undone, James. I tried to teach you that." The conversation had taken on a double meaning that I couldn't fully decipher. James seemed to understand something I didn't, because his face paled slightly. "Is that why you invited us here, to teach me another lesson?" Before Harold could respond, the doorbell rang again. This time the change in the room was palpable. Thomas straightened in his chair. Harold and Margaret exchanged a look. James reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it painfully tight. "Excuse me," the server said, leaving to answer the door. James leaned close to me, his breath warm against my ear. "When I give the signal, follow me immediately. No questions." Before I could process what he meant, heavy footsteps approached the dining room. James shot to his feet, pulling me up with him. "We need to use the bathroom," he announced loudly, grabbing Grace's hand as well. "All of us! Family emergency." Without waiting for a response, he pulled us from the dining room and down the hall. Behind us, I heard new voices in the dining room, deep and authoritative. James moved with purpose, dragging us toward the kitchen. "James, what is happening?" I hissed. "Not now," he replied, his voice tight with fear. In the kitchen, he headed straight for a door at the back, yanking it open to reveal a walk-in pantry filled with shelves of food. Without explanation, he pushed Grace and me inside, following quickly and pulling the door nearly closed behind us, leaving just a small crack to see through. "Mommy, it's dark," Grace whimpered, clinging to my leg. "What's going on?" I started to ask, confusion and fear building. "Shh, be quiet," James hissed, pressing his finger to his lips. Footsteps approached from the hallway, heavy and measured. Through the small opening, I caught a glimpse of two men in dark suits entering the kitchen. They weren't staff or family members. One of them had a hand inside his jacket in a way that made my blood run cold. "They said they were in here," one man said, his voice low and threatening. James pulled the door fully closed, plunging us into darkness. In the pitch blackness of the pantry, I held Grace close against me, feeling her small body trembling. My mind raced with questions, but the fear in James's voice had been enough to silence me. We stood absolutely still, hardly daring to breathe, as footsteps moved around the kitchen. "Check everywhere," a gruff voice ordered from the other side of the door. "Mr. Caldwell said they came this way." Mr. Caldwell, Harold, James's own father, was directing these men to find us. The betrayal was incomprehensible. Cabinets opened and closed, drawers slid open. The footsteps drew nearer to our hiding place. Grace buried her face against me, and I covered her mouth gently with my hand, silently apologizing for scaring her. James moved slightly, positioning himself between us and the door. Then, like a miracle, a phone rang somewhere in the house. "Boss wants you back in the dining room," someone called from a distance. "Says it's urgent." The footsteps retreated, and the kitchen fell silent. Still, we remained frozen in place for several minutes. Finally, James clicked on the flashlight of his phone, keeping the beam pointed downward to minimize the light that might escape around the door. "Are they gone?" I whispered. James nodded, his face ghastly in the low light. For now, but they'll be back. James, you need to tell me what's happening right now, I demanded, keeping my voice low but firm. Who are those men? Why is your father helping them find us? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of distress I'd seen countless times during our marriage, but never with such raw fear behind it. I never told you the real reason I left the family business, he began. It wasn't just about following my passion for photography. I found something, Ruth, something terrible. What did you find? I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Financial records. Dad's company was laundering money for a criminal organization, millions of dollars cleaned through legitimate investments. James's voice shook. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said it was just business, that everyone at that level did things that existed in gray areas. I stared at him in disbelief. The refined, imposing Harold I'd met was involved with criminals. It seemed impossible, yet it explained the excessive security, the tension, the cryptic conversations. I threatened to go to the authorities, James continued. That's when Dad and Thomas turned on me. They said if I talked, I'd go down with them since I'd been part of the company. They threatened you too, even though we were newly married, said they'd make sure you were implicated. Grace tugged at my dress. Mommy, I'm scared. Who are the bad men? I stroked her hair, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. It's okay, sweetie. We're playing a hiding game right now. Your daddy is going to keep us safe. James knelt to Grace's level. That's right, Princess. And you're doing a great job being quiet. We need to stay that way a little longer, okay? She nodded solemnly, and James continued his explanation in a lower voice. I took copies of some of the records before I left. Insurance in case they ever came after me. I told Dad if anything happened to us, the evidence would go straight to the FBI. That's why he left us alone all these years. Then why invite us here now? Why the reconciliation? I asked, though the answer was beginning to dawn on me. It was a trap, James said bitterly. They never wanted reconciliation. The organization Dad works with must be pressuring him, maybe threatening him. They want those records, and Dad promised to deliver me to them. The full horror of our situation crashed over me. We were in a house full of people who had lured us here under false pretenses, with armed criminals searching for us. And our daughter was caught in the middle of it all. From the dining room came the sound of raised voices, a crash like something heavy falling, a woman's scream that might have been Margaret's. They're losing patience, James whispered. We need to get out of here. How? They're probably watching all the exits. James turned his flashlight toward the back of the pantry. There's another way. When I was a kid, I found a passage behind this pantry. It was part of the original house, probably built during Prohibition. It leads out to the garden. He moved deeper into the pantry, shifting boxes of crackers and cans of vegetables on a bottom shelf. Then he pressed against the wall panel behind them, and to my amazement, it gave way, revealing a small door I would never have noticed. I used to hide here when Dad was in one of his rages. James explained a lifetime of pain in those few words. He reached into his pocket and removed his wristwatch, a simple timepiece I'd given him for our 10th anniversary. With practiced movements, he pried open the back, revealing a tiny USB drive hidden inside. The evidence, he said, pressing it into my palm. If we get separated, you take Grace and go straight to the police. Tell them everything. The implication that we might be separated sent a chill through me. We're staying together, I insisted. Ruth, listen to me. His voice was urgent. Those men won't stop. If they catch us, I'll try to buy you time. Your priority has to be getting Grace to safety. Before I could argue more, shouting erupted from elsewhere in the house. James gestured to the hidden door. Go, now. I clutched Grace's hand, ducking to enter the narrow passage with James right behind us. The door closed silently, leaving us in a cramped, musty tunnel lit only by James's phone. This leads under the house and comes up in a storage shed near the garden wall, James explained. Once we're out, we'll have to move quickly across the lawn to the side gate. There's less security on that side of the property. We moved as quietly as possible through the passage bent at the waist to avoid hitting our heads on the low ceiling. Grace was small enough to walk upright, and she stayed remarkably calm, sensing the gravity of the situation despite her young age. After what seemed like an eternity in that claustrophobic space, we reached another small door. James pressed his ear against it, listening intently before pushing it open. We emerged into a garden shed filled with tools and equipment dusty and obviously seldom used. James peered through a dirty window. The coast looks clear. We'll run for those tall hedges, then make our way around to the gate. I gripped Grace's hand tighter. Ready, sweetheart. We're going to play another game. We need to run very fast and very quietly like ninjas. Can you do that? She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. James counted down from 3, then pushed the shed door open. We dashed across the open lawn toward the hedges, hunched low. My heart pounded in my chest, every sense heightened, expecting shouts or worse at any moment. We made it to the hedges undetected and crouched behind them. The side gate was visible about 50 yards away, partially obscured by ornamental trees, so close to escape. "I'll go first," James whispered. "If it's clear, I'll wave you over." Before I could stop him, he darted out from our hiding place, keeping low as he moved from one bit of cover to the next. He was halfway to the gate when a shout rang out. "There, by the cherry trees!" James froze, then sprinted toward the gate. A man appeared from around the corner of the house, running in pursuit. My breath caught in my throat as I pulled Grace closer, trying to make ourselves invisible behind the hedge. "Mommy," Grace whispered, "is Daddy going to be okay?" I didn't answer, couldn't answer. The man was gaining on James, who had reached the gate only to find it locked. He rattled it desperately, then turned to face his pursuer. "Run!" he shouted in our direction. "Ruth, run now!" I hesitated, torn between self-preservation and loyalty. Grace tugged at my hand. "We can't leave Daddy," she pleaded. In that moment, I made a decision that defied all logic, but felt unquestionably right. "Stay here," I told Grace, positioning her in the densest part of the hedge. "Don't move until I come back, or Daddy comes for you." "Mommy, no," she cried, but I was already moving, staying low and circling around the garden. The shed we'd emerged from had garden tools inside. I retraced our steps, slipping back inside, and grabbing the first substantial item, I found a heavy metal shovel. By the time I emerged again, the situation had deteriorated. James was on the ground, the man standing over him. They were too far away for me to hear their exchange, but the man's posture was menacing. I circled behind them, using the trees and shrubs for cover. Grace remained hidden, a small blessing in this nightmare. As I drew closer, I could see James's face was bloody. The man had pulled him to his feet and was patting him down, searching for something, presumably the evidence on the USB drive, now clutched in my palm. I approached from behind, shovel raised, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But this was James, my James, the father of our child, the man who had saved us from his own family's dangerous secrets. I couldn't abandon him. The impact of the shovel against the man's back made a sickening thud. He cried out, stumbling forward and losing his grip on James. I raised the shovel again, but before I could strike, the man whirled around, his hand reaching inside his jacket. "Ruth, down!" James shouted. I dropped just as a third figure appeared from the shadows. Thomas stood there, a gun in his hand, pointed directly at the man who had attacked James. "Step away from my brother," Thomas said, his voice surprisingly steady. The man froze, his eyes darting between Thomas and James. "Your father won't like this," he said. "My father doesn't know what's good for him anymore," Thomas replied. "Now move away, or I'll shoot." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the man slowly raised his hands and stepped back. "You're making a mistake," he said. "They won't stop coming." "Maybe," Thomas acknowledged. "But not today. Not now." In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. The man's head snapped toward the sound, then back to Thomas. "You called the cops." Thomas didn't answer, but his expression confirmed it. The man swore and bolted, disappearing into the gathering darkness of the garden. James staggered to his feet, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Thomas. His brother's hand trembled slightly as he lowered the gun. I couldn't let them hurt you, not for Dad's mistakes. You knew, James said, not a question but a statement. All these years you knew what was happening. Thomas nodded, shame etched on his features. I did. I told myself it was just business like Dad said, but it's gone too far. They're threatening the twins now. The sirens grew louder. Blue and red lights flashed at the front of the property. I called the police before dinner, Thomas explained. Anonymously. I was going to warn you, but they were watching me too closely. Grace. I suddenly remembered turning back toward the hedge where I'd left her. I've got her, James said, limping in that direction. Thomas handed me the gun grip first. Take this. Get your family out through the side gate. The code is 5924. There's a police car waiting on the street around the corner. I told them to expect you. What about you? I asked, surprised by the concern I felt for this man who had been complicit in endangering us. I'm going to face the consequences, he said simply. It's time someone in this family did. The next few hours passed in a blur of police statements, medical examinations, and hushed conversations in sterile rooms. Grace, exhausted by the ordeal, eventually fell asleep on a couch in the police station, her head in my lap. James sat across from us, a bandage over his eye, his hand clasping mine whenever possible. The raid on the Caldwell estate had resulted in multiple arrests. Harold was taken away in handcuffs, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. The two men in suits were identified as members of a known criminal organization with international connections. Margaret, apparently genuinely ignorant of the extent of her husband's activities, was being questioned but not charged. Thomas, true to his word, confessed everything. In exchange for his cooperation as a key witness, he would likely receive a reduced sentence. The evidence on the USB drive, combined with Thomas's testimony and the financial records the police seized from Harold's office, created an airtight case. What happens now? I asked James as we waited for the detective to return with the paperwork, allowing us to leave. He looked down at our sleeping daughter, gently stroking her hair. We rebuild, again. The detective who had been handling our case, a compassionate woman named Detective Rivera, returned with forms for us to sign. We'll need you to remain available for further questioning, she explained. But you're free to go home for now. We'll have officers stationed near your house for protection until we're sure all members of the organization have been apprehended. Will they come after us? I asked, the fear still fresh. It's unlikely, she assured me. With Mr. Caldwell in custody and the evidence secure, you're no longer targets, but we don't take chances. We were escorted home by police, arriving at our modest house well past midnight. It felt surreal to walk through our familiar rooms after what we'd experienced. Grace didn't wake as James carried her to bed, tucking her in with a gentleness that brought tears to my eyes. In our bedroom, as we finally prepared for sleep, James broke down. His shoulders shook with silent sobs as the weight of the day's events, and perhaps the burden of the secret he'd carried for years, finally overwhelmed him. I should have told you, he said between breaths. I should never have brought you and Grace into danger. I held him, my own tears flowing. You protected us as best you could. You couldn't have known they would use Thanksgiving as a trap. My own father, he whispered. He was willing to sacrifice us. I had no words to ease that particular pain. Instead, I held him until his breathing steadied and he drifted into an exhausted sleep. The weeks that followed were challenging. We gave additional statements to the FBI, who had taken over the case due to its connection to organized crime. James provided detailed explanations of the financial records he'd preserved, helping the authorities understand the full scope of the money laundering operation. Grace had nightmares, waking up crying about bad men and hiding games. We found a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and slowly our daughter began to process what had happened in age-appropriate ways. James struggled with guilt and betrayal. He blamed himself for not seeing through the invitation for putting us at risk. Some nights, I'd find him checking the locks over and over or staring out windows watching for threats. He began seeing a therapist as well, working through the complex emotions of having a father who valued criminal connections over his own son's life. 6 months after that fateful Thanksgiving, we made the decision to move. The constant reminders and lingering fear were too much. We found a home in a different city where James could establish his photography business anew, and I secured a teaching position at a well-regarded elementary school. Grace adjusted quickly to her new surroundings, her resilience a constant source of amazement to us both. The legal proceedings continued. Harold went to trial and received a substantial prison sentence. The criminal organization he had worked with saw several key members arrested and charged. Thomas, fulfilling his plea agreement, provided testimony that helped dismantle a significant portion of their operation. One day, a letter arrived from Thomas sent from the minimum security facility where he was serving a reduced sentence. It was brief but heartfelt. James, I hope this finds you and your family well and healing. I want you to know that I think about you every day and regret the years we lost and the pain our family caused you. What you did took courage. I never had until it was almost too late. The twins ask about their uncle and cousin. Perhaps someday when I've served my time, we might find a way to be family again, not as Caldwells, but as something better. Thomas. James read it several times, emotions playing across his face. Finally, he folded it and put it away without comment. Some wounds would take longer to heal than others. As another Thanksgiving approached, we decided to reclaim the holiday. We invited friends from our new community, colleagues from work, and families from Grace's school who had nowhere else to go. Our home was filled with laughter and genuine warmth, so different from the cold opulence of the Caldwell mansion. Watching James carve a turkey for our guests, seeing Grace proudly helping serve dessert, I realized we had emerged from the shadow of his family's corruption, stronger and more united. The trauma remained part of our story, but it no longer defined us. That night, after our guest had departed and Grace was asleep, James and I sat on our porch looking at the stars. I never thanked you, he said quietly. For what? For coming back for me in the garden. You could have taken Grace and run. Most people would have. I thought about that moment of decision, the instinct that had driven me back toward danger rather than away from it. That's not who we are, I said simply. We face things together. He took my hand, his touch conveying what words could not. We sat in comfortable silence, two survivors who had discovered the true meaning of family in the most unexpected way. Do you think we'll ever hear from them again? I asked eventually. Your mother Thomas after he's released. James considered the question. Maybe. I don't know if I want to, but I think I could face it now, whatever comes. As we headed inside, I paused at Grace's room, watching her sleep peacefully. The fear that had haunted her dreams for months had finally subsided. Children, I reflected, often understand the essence of truth better than adults. Grace had never been confused about what family meant. It was the adults who complicated things with expectations, obligations, and secrets. The pantry that had hidden us from danger had become a symbol in my mind. In the darkest moment when everything seemed lost, we had found a way forward. Not through wealth or power, but through courage, truth, and unwavering commitment to protecting those we loved. If you've ever faced a moment where family became something unrecognizable, where trust was broken in ways that seemed beyond repair, I hope our story gives you strength. Sometimes the family we choose to build is more important than the one we're born into. Sometimes the darkest moments lead to unexpected light. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your loved ones? Share your experience in the comments below. If our story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more true stories of survival and healing. And remember, in a world where some families are built on secrets and lies, creating a home founded on honesty and love is the most powerful act of rebellion. Thank you for listening, and may your own family gatherings be filled with genuine connection and care.